On September 1, 1939, exactly as German panzers smashed across the Polish border to ignite the Second World War, General George C. Marshall was sworn in as Chief of Staff of the United States Army. The force he inherited was a statistical joke. Ranking 17th globally in size, just behind Portugal, the American military was staggeringly obsolete. Soldiers were practicing maneuvers with wooden rifles and driving commercial trucks painted with the word tank. To the Axis powers, it was a skeletal force, structurally incapable of fighting a modern, mechanized war. Yet within a few short years, this obsolete skeleton would expand into an 8 million-strong global juggernaut. The standard historical narrative of this staggering expansion is often reduced to a comfortable, patriotic montage. We picture buzzing assembly lines, enthusiastic recruitment posters plastered across city walls, and a unified nation spontaneously rising to meet the fascist threat. But this romanticized myth of effortless American patriotism completely ignores the absolute organizational terror operating behind closed doors at the War Department. Building a multi-million-man fighting force from that obsolete skeleton required far more than simply printing draft cards and redirecting steel production. It demanded the systematic dismantling of a deeply entrenched, aging peacetime officer corps that had stagnated since 1918. It required dragging a fiercely isolationist and socially fractured society into a global conflict it desperately wanted to avoid. Most dangerously, it involved risking outright political suicide to force the first peacetime conscription act in American history through a highly reluctant Congress, a measure that would eventually survive by a razor-thin margin of just a single vote. This investigation strips away the comfortable folklore to examine the cold, clinical mechanics of military expansion. It is a story of ruthless personnel purges, staggering logistical gambles, and the calculated institutional destruction required to build a modern army from absolute zero. The core of this analysis rests on a seemingly impossible administrative and tactical problem. How exactly do you construct an effective, highly complex global military machine faster than the war itself is accelerating, without completely destroying the fragile command structure you rely on to lead it? To understand the sheer scale of the crisis facing the War Department in the autumn of 1939, one must look at the deliberate institutional starvation of the preceding 2 decades. Following the armistice of 1918, the United States fundamentally rejected a large, standing military. The prevailing national sentiment, codified by an aggressively isolationist Congress, viewed a robust army not as a shield, but as a dangerous magnet for foreign entanglements. Consequently, throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the military establishment operated under crushing financial constraints. Appropriations were slashed so deeply that basic structural maintenance became an unattainable luxury. Across the country, skeletal garrisons occupied decaying World War I-era wooden barracks. The total number of active-duty combat troops hovered just under 140,000 men, scattered in small, isolated posts. Ammunition reserves were so thoroughly depleted that field commanders strictly rationed rifle practice, often forcing infantrymen to simulate live fire by throwing rocks or shouting during tactical drills. Budget requests for modernized 105mm howitzers, advanced radio communication networks, or experimental motorized transport were routinely dismissed on Capitol Hill as fiscally irresponsible. At one point during the Great Depression, the federal government allocated significantly more funding to civilian public works programs than to the entire national defense budget. This severe financial strangulation was compounded by a paralyzing internal bureaucracy, most notably the rigid seniority system that governed the officer corps. Promotion was dictated almost entirely by time and grade, rather than merit, tactical brilliance, or physical capability. The result was a catastrophic demographic bottleneck. Thousands of officers commissioned during the frantic mobilization of 1917 found themselves trapped in lower ranks for 15 to 20 years, serving as aging captains and majors in a perpetually shrinking force. This stagnant environment was cynically referred to within the ranks as promotion by death, meaning a junior officer could realistically only advance when a superior either passed away or reached the mandatory retirement age. By the time Marshall assumed his role as Chief of Staff, the top echelons of command were monopolized by elderly veterans of the previous war. Many of these senior commanders were in their late 60s, physically unfit for the rigorous demands of modern field operations, and deeply entrenched in the static tactical doctrines of trench warfare. This gerontocracy actively stifled intellectual growth and innovation within the ranks. Younger officers who closely observed the Spanish Civil War, noting the decisive impact of mechanized armor and close air support, found their analytical reports buried or ignored by superiors who still passionately championed the utility of the horse cavalry. The institution was not just technologically obsolete, it was doctrinally paralyzed, utterly incapable of processing the speed, coordination, and lethality of the mechanized warfare rapidly developing across the Atlantic. As the German war machine ripped through Poland in late 1939, Marshall faced a horrifying equation. The intelligence crossing his desk detailed a highly integrated, mobile, and battle-tested European threat. Yet his own forces lacked the trained manpower and logistical framework to deploy even a single, fully equipped field army. To close this dangerous gap, Marshall realized he had to fight his initial battles not against foreign adversaries, but inside the hearing rooms of the United States Capitol. The domestic political environment was intensely hostile to any form of military expansion. The legacy of the Nye Committee, which had popularized the narrative that greedy arms manufacturers and bankers had tricked America into the First World War, remained a powerful, paralyzing force in American politics. Isolationist lawmakers, backed by millions of vocal constituents, fiercely defended the Neutrality Acts, determined to quarantine the United States from European bloodshed. Congress was systematically legislating to prevent readiness, equating military preparedness with an active, secret desire for war. Marshall understood that aggressive public demands for a massive buildup would be instantly branded as warmongering, potentially resulting in punitive budget cuts that would destroy what little military infrastructure remained. Instead, he was forced to play a precarious, exhausting game of legislative chess. He spent months walking the corridors of Congress, armed not with patriotic rhetoric, but with cold, undeniable data regarding the vulnerability of the Western Hemisphere. He requested incremental increases, a few $1,000,000 for winter clothing, a modest expansion of the regular Army recruitment cap, struggling to secure the absolute minimum required to keep the military machinery from seizing up entirely. The geopolitical calculus shattered in the spring of 1940. The sudden, devastating collapse of France in just 6 weeks, coupled with the frantic evacuation of British forces at Dunkirk, sent a shockwave of panic through Washington. The English Channel and the Atlantic Ocean no longer seemed like impenetrable geographic moats. The terrifying prospect of the British fleet falling into German hands meant the American East Coast could face an immediate, existential threat from the sea. Leveraging this narrow window of sudden dread, Marshall pushed for an unprecedented measure, the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940. It was the first peacetime conscription bill in the history of the United States, designed to register all men between the ages of 21 and 35, aiming to expand the active army to 1.4 million men by the following year. In an election year, proposing a draft of this magnitude was widely considered political suicide. The backlash was immediate, highly organized, and ferocious. Opponents argued vehemently that peacetime conscription was the hallmark of the very totalitarian regimes America claimed to despise. Mothers marched on Capitol Hill carrying anti-war banners. Prominent isolationist senators threatened to filibuster the legislation into oblivion to protect American youth. Through the blistering summer of 1940, Marshall testified relentlessly before hostile committees. He refused to be drawn into emotional debates, focusing instead on the stark, unforgiving mathematics of mass mobilization. He methodically demonstrated that even if Congress authorized unlimited funding to build modern weapons immediately, it would take a minimum of a year to properly train the men to operate them. Without a draft, the newly funded factories would produce advanced tanks with no trained crews and complex artillery pieces with no gunners to fire them. The ultimate margin of national survival was time, and time was a resource the United States had completely exhausted during 2 decades of neglect. The battle over the Draft Act consumed the legislative branch, exposing the deep, unresolved fractures within American society regarding its responsibility on the global stage. Yet Marshall's clinical, persistent presentation of the strategic reality slowly eroded the isolationist blockade. On September 16, 1940, the Selective Service Act was signed into law, surviving the legislative gauntlet by an incredibly narrow margin. It was a monumental administrative victory, fundamentally rewriting the relationship between the American citizen and the state in times of peace. Almost overnight, the massive mechanisms of mass mobilization ground into motion. Registration boards were established in every county, draft numbers were drawn from a massive glass bowl in Washington, and hundreds of thousands of young civilians from farms, factories, and universities suddenly found themselves holding federal induction orders. Train stations across the country filled with confused, untrained recruits heading toward newly constructed, sprawling reception centers. Marshall managed to push through the peacetime draft and secure the men on paper, but when he finally tested this new army in the field, the results were a terrifying wake-up call. In the late summer of 1941, the War Department staged the Louisiana Maneuvers, the largest peacetime training exercises in American history. Over 400,000 newly drafted civilians and regular Army troops were divided into two massive opposing forces, clashing across 3,400 square miles of sweltering swamps and pine forests. It was designed to be a grand rehearsal for modern combat. Instead, it became a spectacular, highly public humiliation. Supply networks instantly collapsed. Convoys of requisitioned civilian trucks sank into the mud, creating 30-mile traffic jams that choked the rural road system. Quartermasters lost track of whole battalions, leaving exhausted, hungry recruits to forage for food in local grocery stores. Radio communications devolved into a chaotic wall of static, but the mechanical and logistical breakdowns were completely overshadowed by the catastrophic intellectual failure at the top. The rigid gerontocracy that had monopolized the Army's higher ranks since 1918 was suddenly forced to manage fast-moving, simulated mechanized warfare. They froze. Evaluating officers, the umpires assigned to score the war games, watched in disbelief as senior generals issued orders based on reconnaissance reports that were 12 hours out of date. Elderly commanders ordered slow, linear infantry assaults directly into simulated armored thrusts. Headquarters were left entirely exposed to enemy flanking maneuvers. Umpires routinely rode up to bewildered generals to inform them that, mathematically, their entire divisions had just been annihilated by enemy artillery they didn't even know existed. Dozens of reporters from national newspapers and magazines were embedded with the troops, documenting every blunder. The traditional military instinct in the face of such public failure was to classify the umpire reports, bury the embarrassment, and protect the institution's pride. This level of exposure threatened to shatter civilian morale and give isolationist politicians the exact ammunition they needed to repeal the newly passed Draft Act and defund the military. But Marshall saw the disaster differently. He saw undeniable leverage. Returning to Washington, Marshall weaponized the humiliation. Armed with the damning, highly publicized umpire evaluations, he demanded Congress grant him emergency authority to bypass the paralyzing, time-and-grade seniority system. He activated what became known internally as plucking boards, relentless committees empowered to evaluate the physical and mental stamina of the officer corps. The administrative bloodletting was swift and absolute. Marshall forcibly retired, reassigned, or sidelined dozens of senior generals and hundreds of colonels. Men who had spent 2 decades quietly waiting for their stars were abruptly handed their pensions. To fill the massive command vacuum, Marshall reached deep down the roster, bypassing seniority to elevate a fiercely ambitious, largely unproven generation of younger officers who had actually thrived in the Louisiana chaos. He promoted a colonel named Dwight D. Eisenhower, whose brilliant logistical planning as a staff officer had systematically outmaneuvered the opposing army. He elevated a quiet infantry instructor named Omar Bradley. He unleashed a volatile cavalryman named George S. Patton, who had bypassed the paralyzing traffic jams by purchasing fuel from local gas stations with his own money to keep his armored brigade moving. By cannibalizing his own command structure, Marshall broke the institutional paralysis. With the deadwood ruthlessly cleared out and these ambitious minds holding the reins, the mobilization fundamentally shifted. It transitioned from a delicate political negotiation into a hyper-accelerated, terrifying mathematical scale-up. The scale-up from the political victory of the draft to the physical reality of a global army required an immediate confrontation with the cold, unforgiving mathematics of total war. Following the shock of Pearl Harbor, the initial panic within the War Department demanded an astronomical mobilization. Early strategic estimates crossing Marshall's desk, drafted by planners looking at the terrifying scope of a two-front war stretching from the hedgerows of Europe to the jungles of the Pacific, suggested an ultimate requirement of over 200 combat divisions. Planners envisioned a massive 215-division juggernaut designed to match the staggering scale of the Soviet Red Army and the battle-hardened Wehrmacht. But Marshall, alongside his brilliant operational architects like General Thomas Handy, immediately recognized that pursuing such a massive ground force would inadvertently trigger a catastrophic national defeat. They ran the brutal demographic equations of the American industrial base and discovered a terrifying ceiling. A nation, regardless of its wealth, possesses a finite pool of human capital. Every young, able-bodied man holding an M1 Garand rifle in a trench is a man who is actively removed from the domestic workforce. He is not riveting the steel hull of a Sherman tank in Detroit. He is not mining critical coal veins in Pennsylvania. He is not welding Liberty ships in the Oakland shipyards. And he is not harvesting the massive wheat crops in Kansas required to feed the Allied world. The United States was not merely arming its own expanding military. Under the geopolitical obligations of the Lend-Lease Act, America was contractually bound to serve as the primary industrial engine for the British Empire and the Soviet Union. If the War Department drafted millions of industrial workers, miners, and farmers into the infantry, it would guarantee the collapse of the very assembly lines required to keep the Allied coalition from disintegrating. The factories would fall silent, the shipyards would empty, and the armies of Britain and Russia would be starved of the steel and explosives keeping the Axis forces at bay. To prevent this industrial suicide, Marshall made a calculated, terrifying, and deeply controversial decision. He deliberately capped the United States Army at just 90 combat divisions. It became known within the highest echelons of command as the 90-division gamble, and it remains one of the most perilous strategic choices of the entire conflict. Compared to the massive 300-division army fielded by the Soviet Union, or the sprawling hundreds of divisions maintained by Nazi Germany, the United States would fight the greatest war in human history with a shockingly thin ground force. This strategy dictated a profound shift in American military doctrine. The United States would not win by overwhelming the enemy with endless waves of infantry, but by providing overwhelming, crushing material superiority. The strategy relied on endless artillery shells, thousands of heavy bombers, and limitless fleets of mechanized transport to compensate for the deliberate lack of sheer manpower. But the gamble meant the math offered absolutely no margin for error. Every single one of those 90 divisions had to be deployed into active combat theaters, and every single one had to be maintained in a state of continuous operational capability. There would be no massive strategic reserves waiting safely behind the lines. If the mathematical models were wrong, if the Axis forces proved more resilient than anticipated, if the shipping lanes were severed by U-boats, or if domestic industrial output faltered for even a few weeks, the American army would be bled white, stretched to the breaking point across the globe. Yet, even with the strict 90-division cap firmly in place, the manpower mathematics simply did not add up. The administrative and logistical tale of a modern, mechanized fighting force was incredibly long and demanding. For every combat rifleman actively engaging the enemy on the front line, the Army required roughly 10 support personnel operating in the rear to keep him armed, fed, medicated, and moving forward. Marshall looked at the rosters and saw hundreds of thousands of able-bodied, combat-eligible men stationed safely inside the borders of the United States, working securely as radio operators, truck drivers, supply clerks, meteorologists, and parachute riggers. He desperately needed those men in combat units to make the 90-division gamble viable. The solution to this localized manpower deficit required shattering one of the most deeply entrenched social and institutional taboos in the history of the American military establishment. Working closely with Congresswoman Edith Nourse Rogers, the War Department aggressively championed the creation of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which would later be formalized directly into the military structure as the Women's Army Corps, or WAC. This was not a superficial public relations exercise designed to project an image of national unity, nor was it a simple gesture of equality. It was a desperate, coldly calculated logistical maneuver designed to harvest a massive, completely untapped reservoir of human resources. The resistance from the traditional military establishment was immediate, visceral, and ferocious. Senior commanders, many of whom had only grudgingly accepted the replacement of horse cavalry with mechanized armor, were utterly appalled by the prospect of female soldiers wearing government-issued uniforms and operating within the chain of command. The debates on the floor of Congress frequently devolved into vicious, patronizing arguments, warning about the imminent moral decay of American womanhood, the destruction of the traditional family unit, and the collapse of military discipline. Vicious whisper campaigns and highly organized, slanderous rumors circulated through the press and the ranks, disgustingly suggesting that the military was simply drafting women to serve as state-sponsored camp followers to boost male morale. Marshall flatly ignored the social hysterics and political pearl-clutching, focusing entirely on the ruthless utility of the program. He understood that vague notions of patriotism alone would not win a global mechanized war. Maximum operational efficiency would. The War Department relentlessly pushed the initiative forward, and the women who volunteered were subjected to intense scrutiny and rigorous organizational standards. Initially, deeply skeptical commanders relegated these women to basic clerical work, allowing them to serve as typists, switchboard operators, and file clerks. But the sheer competence, organizational skill, and technical capability of the WACS quickly forced the reluctant military hierarchy to dramatically expand their operational footprint. Within a year, women were operating complex, highly classified cryptographic machines, plotting vital weather patterns for heavy bomber squadrons preparing to strike Europe, repairing the heavy engines of transport trucks, and coordinating global radio traffic from massive communication hubs. By the end of the conflict, over 150,000 women had served in the WAC. The cold, logistical reality was that every single one of those women represented a highly trained male soldier who could be detached from a safe, stateside desk and immediately shipped to a combat zone in North Africa, Italy, or the Pacific Theater. It was a massive, highly successful reallocation of human capital, executed in direct defiance of deep-seated cultural resistance, driven purely by the absolute necessity to keep the 90-division gamble mathematically afloat. With the macro-level demographics calculated, the draft funnels operating at maximum capacity, and the personnel reallocation strategies in place, the War Department faced its next monumental hurdle: the physical and psychological manufacturing of a modern army. The United States did not possess a deeply rooted, generational militaristic culture like the Prussian traditions of Germany or the imperial discipline of Japan. The raw human material pouring into the sprawling, rapidly constructed new reception centers consisted of fiercely independent, highly individualistic, and deeply skeptical civilians. They were hardened farmers fleeing the remnants of the Dust Bowl, unionized factory workers from the industrial hubs of Chicago and Detroit, privileged university students from the Ivy League, and impoverished sharecroppers from the Deep South. Thousands of these inductees were functionally illiterate. Many required extensive dental reconstruction and medical rehabilitation just to meet the baseline physical standards for military service. The War Department had to construct a massive, systematic training pipeline capable of processing this chaotic, disparate human material into a highly standardized, universally interchangeable military product. The solution was the unprecedented application of industrial assembly line logic directly to human psychology and physical training. At massive, newly built installations sprawling across tens of thousands of acres, like Fort Benning for the infantry, Fort Bragg for the artillery, and Fort Knox for the armored divisions, the Army literally created an assembly line for combat troops. The foundational bedrock of this massive sorting system was the Army General Classification Test, known as the AGCT. Every single inductee, regardless of background, was required to sit for this mandatory cognitive and mechanical aptitude test. The resulting scores were not used for academic placement, but to ruthlessly and efficiently categorize and route personnel through the war machine. A high mechanical aptitude score immediately sent a farm boy with a knack for tractors to to the Armored Corps, where he would be taught the intricate mechanics of maintaining the radial engine of a Sherman tank under fire. A high spatial reasoning and mathematics score might instantly route a former bank clerk into the field artillery to calculate complex ballistic trajectories and firing solutions. The military was systematically identifying, extracting, and exploiting the hidden talents of a massive civilian population, optimizing their placement within the expanding military apparatus with cold precision. The actual training regimen was governed by an ever-expanding, incredibly detailed library of field manuals. These highly specific, rigidly structured booklets dictated absolutely every aspect of a soldier's existence, from the exact geometric folds required for a wool blanket during a barracks inspection to the precise tactical deployment and spacing of a rifle squad maneuvering under heavy mortar fire. The ultimate goal of this relentless instruction was absolute, unwavering standardization. A radio operator trained in the humid swamps of Georgia had to be able to instantly plug into a signals unit deployed in the blistering deserts of North Africa, and he had to understand exactly the same encrypted codes, operate the exact same radio equipment, and follow the exact same operational protocols without a moment of hesitation. A replacement lieutenant stepping off a transport ship in England had to be able to seamlessly take command of a frontline platoon from an officer he had never met, utilizing exactly the same tactical language and doctrinal approach. The grueling 13 weeks of basic training were specifically designed to break down and strip away the individualistic civilian identity, forcefully replacing it with the modular, compliant, and highly disciplined mindset required to operate within a massive, lethal bureaucracy. It was a brutal, physically exhausting, and deliberately impersonal process, but it successfully generated a uniquely American military force. They were not ideological fanatics, but highly competent, technically proficient, and completely interchangeable human components. Yet, producing these highly standardized 90 divisions was only half of the strategic equation. Projecting this massive, newly forged force across two hostile, submarine-infested oceans and sustaining them in active combat theaters was a logistical nightmare of utterly unprecedented proportions. A modern mechanized division is not a static entity. It is an incredibly ravenous, continuously consuming beast. It devours hundreds of tons of high explosive ammunition, thousands of daily food rations, vital medical supplies, and massive quantities of high-octane aviation and diesel fuel every single day, regardless of whether it is actively engaging the enemy in a major offensive or sitting quietly in a reserve staging area. The War Department had to build a global, heavily armored circulatory system from scratch to keep these divisions alive. Under the relentless, driving command of General Brehon Somervell, the Army Service Forces rapidly evolved into the largest, most complex, and most heavily funded corporate entity on the planet. The logistics required tracking tens of millions of highly specific, distinct items. The system had to account for everything from microscopic firing pins for M1 rifles and fragile glass vials of life-saving penicillin to massive replacement tank treads and millions of pairs of standard-issue wool socks designed to prevent trench foot. Every single item had to be mathematically calculated for usage rates, procured from civilian contractors, packaged for harsh weather conditions, transported by rail networks to the massive ports on the eastern seaboard, loaded methodically onto transport ships, and sailed across the treacherous U-boat-patrolled waters of the Atlantic to vast, sprawling supply depots constructed in Great Britain. This was the relentless mathematics of shipping tonnage, a daily, high-stakes struggle to balance the physical weight and cubic volume of critical war material against the strictly limited available cargo space of the expanding merchant marine fleet. Planners, working deep within the Pentagon, operated vast, complex, room-sized wall charts, meticulously tracking the precise geographic location of every single cargo vessel and maintaining manifests detailing the specific contents of their holds. If a frontline quartermaster in a muddy encampment in England requested an emergency shipment of 105mm artillery shells, the system had to be able to instantly locate those specific shells at an ordnance manufacturer manufacturing plant in Ohio. The planners then had to secure priority clearance on a freight train to route them directly to the Brooklyn Navy Yard and precisely slot them into a heavily escorted convoy scheduled to depart within 48 hours. This system completely eliminated the historical military reliance on local foraging and scavenging. The American soldier was engineered to be the best supplied, best fed, and most heavily supported combatant in the entire history of human warfare. But this unprecedented system inherently created a tremendous systemic vulnerability. The American way of war became completely and utterly tethered to an incredibly long, highly complex, and inherently fragile logistical umbilical cord. If the flow of cargo ships slowed down due to weather or enemy action, if the destination ports were heavily bombed, or if the domestic rail networks were disrupted by strikes or accidents, the massive, highly touted firepower of the 90 divisions would be rendered instantly useless. The entire global operation was a high-wire act of industrial and administrative management, relying entirely on the constant, uninterrupted flow of massive, crushing volume. While this immense industrial and administrative engine was rapidly revving up to maximum capacity across the Atlantic, the Axis High Command observed the American transformation with a toxic mixture of deep skepticism and outright fatal arrogance. In Berlin, the seasoned intelligence analysts of Fremde Heere West, the Foreign Armies West intelligence branch of the German military, closely tracked the rapid expansion of the American forces. They intercepted the radio traffic, received detailed reports from spies regarding the massive troop ships crossing the ocean, documented the staggering, almost unbelievable production numbers coming out of American aviation and tank factories, and noted the steady deployment of new infantry and armored divisions to the staging grounds of Britain. But the senior German military establishment, still deeply intoxicated by their lightning-fast early victories in Poland and France, and heavily influenced by the opening, devastating phases of the Soviet invasion, fundamentally misread the true nature of the American threat. To the battle-hardened, ideologically driven veterans of the Wehrmacht High Command, the newly formed American army appeared as nothing more than a massive, but ultimately fragile, civilian mob wearing matching uniforms. They viewed the newly drafted, assembly-line American divisions as poorly trained amateurs. They saw them as soft, undisciplined citizens of a degenerate, highly consumerist society who would instantly shatter and break rank under the immense psychological terror and physical pressure of real, sustained combat. German commanders, deeply steeped in the rigid Prussian traditions of lifelong martial discipline and fueled by the dark ideological fanaticism of the Nazi state, simply could not comprehend how an army built by corporate managers, staffed largely by former accountants, clerks, and farmers, and utterly reliant on complex, bureaucratic supply chains, could possibly match the fighting spirit and tactical brilliance of their elite, battle-tested panzer units. Adolf Hitler himself frequently and loudly dismissed the United States as a fundamentally weak, culturally corrupted, and mixed-race society. He conceded they were highly capable of building consumer goods like refrigerators and automobiles, but he firmly believed they completely lacked the genetic, cultural, and spiritual fortitude required to endure the horrific attrition of modern total war. This profound, deeply ingrained cultural arrogance led directly to one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures of the entire conflict. The German High Command focused almost entirely on the perceived lack of ideological zeal, the absence of a warrior caste, and the lack of traditional combat experience among the American troops. By focusing on these subjective cultural metrics, they completely failed to understand the lethal, overwhelming power of the industrial standardization that George Marshall and his staff had painstakingly built. The Germans simply did not realize that the American military apparatus did not need to rely on the individual tactical brilliance or the fanatical, suicidal bravery of its frontline soldiers. It did not need a warrior caste. Instead, the United States had systematically engineered a massive, unfeeling machine where overwhelming artillery barrages, limitless, skies-darkening air support, and seamless, uninterrupted logistics would systematically annihilate the enemy through sheer, crushing volume and relentless mathematical attrition. The Wehrmacht assumed they would be fighting individual, inexperienced American soldiers in a test of wills. They did not realize they were about to fight the entire, fully synchronized, unyielding output of the American industrial economy. On paper, Marshall's sprawling administrative and structural architecture was an unprecedented masterpiece of modern organizational efficiency. In a span of less than 3 years, the War Department had executed an utterly impossible mathematical and logistical feat. They had perfectly balanced the delicate, high-stakes ratio of domestic factory workers to frontline combat troops. They had successfully integrated hundreds of thousands of women into the military structure to optimize their critical manpower reserves. They had forged millions of fiercely individualistic civilians into highly standardized, fully mechanized, and interchangeable combat units. And they had established a complex, highly functional global logistical pipeline capable of projecting staggering, unrelenting firepower across multiple continents simultaneously. The American military machine was now fully primed, heavily loaded, and aimed directly at the heart of the Axis powers. But this cold, highly clinical system, designed with the exact, unforgiving logic of a Detroit automotive assembly line, contained a fatal, deeply entrenched assumption. It treated fragile human beings exactly like interchangeable machine parts, calculating that a bleeding casualty on the front line could simply be swapped out for a fresh, identical replacement shipped straight from the training depots, just as a mechanic would thoughtlessly replace a broken gear in a damaged tank. This relentless, industrialized approach to human life looked absolutely flawless on the production charts and readiness reports circulating in Washington. Yet, hidden deep within this very corporate logic was a devastating structural flaw, a fundamental miscalculation regarding the dark psychological reality of sustained combat that was about to exact a heavy, incredibly tragic toll on the battlefields of Europe. To make the 90-division gamble mathematically viable, the War Department had to keep every single one of those divisions in continuous combat. Unlike the British or German armies, which routinely rotated shattered divisions off the front line to rebuild them as cohesive units in the rear, the Americans relied on a radically different, distinctly corporate mechanism, the individual replacement system. If a division was fighting in the muddy mountains of Italy or the dense hedgerows of Normandy, it stayed on the line for weeks, sometimes months, without relief. As casualties inevitably mounted, the military simply fed fresh bodies directly into the combat zones to keep the unit's spreadsheet roster at full strength. On paper, it was a masterpiece of logistical efficiency. In reality, it was a psychological meat grinder. A young draftee finishing basic training was immediately separated from the men he had trained with. Instead of deploying alongside familiar friends, he was stripped of any social anchor and shipped overseas as a solitary unit of human cargo. These isolated 18 and 19-year-olds were funneled into massive, impersonal staging areas in Europe, known to the troops as Repeldepots, replacement depots. Here they were entirely reduced to a military occupational specialty code, waiting in the mud for a clerk to match their number to a casualty report arriving from the front. The final leg of this journey was terrifyingly abrupt. A replacement soldier would be pulled from a rear area tent, loaded onto a supply truck under the cover of darkness, and ordered to jump into a freezing, rain-filled foxhole next to a combat-hardened veteran he had never met. There was no orientation, no mentorship, and no time to build trust. The veteran infantrymen, deeply traumatized by the constant loss of their original comrades, often refused to even learn the new arrivals' first names. It wasn't malice. It was a psychological defense mechanism. They knew the grim statistical reality. The new kids made deadly mistakes, and the new kids died first. The casualty rates among these solitary replacements were staggering. In the brutal infantry campaigns of late 1944, some newly arrived riflemen lasted less than 48 hours on the line. They were killed by unseen mortar fire before they ever figured out how their squad operated, or before the platoon leader even knew they were there. Marshall's brilliant administrative machine was successfully projecting unprecedented firepower, but it was doing so by treating its most vulnerable soldiers as disposable ball bearings in a massive industrial engine. This fragile, heavily bleeding pipeline was the only thing keeping the American front intact. The 90 divisions were now stretched dangerously thin across hundreds of miles of European terrain. The relentless logic of the replacement system was barely masking the sheer exhaustion of the men actually fighting the war. And as the freezing winter of 1944 settled over the continent, this precarious mathematical gamble was about to suffer a massive, unexpected shock, one that threatened to shatter the entire organizational foundation of the United States Army. On the morning of December 16, 1944, that mathematical gamble collided with brutal reality. Out of the freezing fog of the Ardennes forest, over 200,000 German troops, spearheaded by heavy panzer divisions, smashed directly into the most overextended sector of the American front. This was the Battle of the Bulge, a massive, desperate counterattack designed to rip the Allied armies in half. It hit exactly where Marshall's system was most vulnerable. Because of the strict 90-division cap, the United States had no vast strategic reserve waiting safely behind the lines. The front was a taut wire, and the German armored thrust snapped it. Within days, American casualties skyrocketed, completely obliterating the careful projections plotted back in the Pentagon. Entire regiments were surrounded and forced to surrender. Divisions that had been resting in supposedly quiet sectors were effectively destroyed. The already fragile individual replacement system instantly ran dry. Commanders urgently radioed the rear for fresh infantry, only to be told that the replacement depots were empty. The sprawling American war machine was suddenly hemorrhaging riflemen faster than the transatlantic pipeline could deliver them. It was the ultimate nightmare scenario War Department planners had dreaded since 1941. The 90-division Army was bleeding to death in the snow. Facing imminent tactical collapse, field commanders were forced into acts of sheer desperation. They turned to the massive 10-to-1 logistical tail that kept the army moving. Across Belgium and Luxembourg, orders came down to strip the rear echelons. Supply clerks, cooks, motor pool mechanics, military police, and anti-aircraft gunners were abruptly pulled from their relatively safe administrative assignments. They were handed M1 rifles, loaded onto open-bed trucks, and rushed directly into the freezing frontline trenches to plug the massive gaps in the line. To the advancing German commanders, interrogating these captured cooks and mechanics, it looked exactly like the final chaotic death throes of a collapsing army. But this is precisely where the hidden brilliance of Marshall's organizational architecture saved the American front. The system was bending to the absolute breaking point, but it did not snap. When a baker or a radio repairman was thrown into a frozen foxhole, he did not panic because the ruthless standardization of the massive stateside training camps finally paid off. Thanks to the identical, rigid instruction dictated by those millions of field manuals, the mechanic already knew exactly how to strip, clean, and fire the standard-issue rifle. The clerk understood the precise tactical spacing required for a squad defense. The anti-aircraft gunner knew how to operate the standardized radio frequencies to call in artillery support. They were completely interchangeable parts, and even assembled in a total panic, the machine functioned. Simultaneously, the deeply embedded logistical spine reacted with terrifying speed. Instead of collapsing under the pressure, the vast administrative network executed a staggering pivot. Within 48 hours, quartermasters completely rerouted the flow of the entire European theater. Thousands of transport trucks drove through blinding blizzards, delivering millions of gallons of aviation fuel, winter gear, and critically, millions of rounds of heavy artillery shells directly to the besieged units. The German offensive, designed to exploit the perceived fragility of a civilian army, instead crashed into a wall of standardized, interchangeable firepower. The hastily assembled lines held. By late January 1945, the German thrust was broken, largely because they simply ran out of fuel and men, while the American logistical pipeline continuously replenished its losses. Marshall's 90-division gamble had survived its most catastrophic test. The brutal, corporate machinery of the United States Army had absorbed the heaviest blow the Third Reich could deliver, clearing the final, bloody path directly into the heart of Germany. By the spring of 1945, the skeletal force that had trained with wooden rifles and painted trucks on the day of Marshall's appointment had transformed into a highly lethal, mechanized armada, fighting simultaneously across multiple continents. The 90 divisions had held, and the logistical tail had sustained them all the way to the Elbe River and the home islands of Japan. Yet, the man who engineered this staggering expansion never commanded a single one of those troops in the field. General George C. Marshall sacrificed his own personal glory, remaining tethered to a desk in Washington, while his hand-picked subordinates, men like Eisenhower and Bradley, reaped the battlefield accolades and secured their places in history. Marshall's triumph was not found in a heroic cavalry charge or a dramatic frontline speech. It was etched in the cold mathematics of shipping tonnage, the ruthless efficiency of the plucking boards, and the systemic integration of millions of drafted citizens and female auxiliaries into a unified war machine. The romanticized myth of the Second World War often prefers the image of spontaneous, righteous patriotism effortlessly crushing tyranny. But the clinical reality is that the Allied victory was constructed through administrative ruthlessness, legislative maneuvering, and the uncompromising standardization of human life. The American military did not win simply by being braver. It won by being systematically engineered to absorb massive friction and deliver crushing, uninterrupted volume. Marshall built an industrial engine that treated soldiers as interchangeable parts, a system that was deeply flawed and psychologically devastating to the individuals fed into its gears. Yet it was the only system mathematically capable of scaling fast enough to save a fractured world from total collapse. Ultimately, George C. Marshall secured the absolute victory of the greatest and most destructive conflict in human history without ever personally firing a single weapon in combat, fundamentally rewriting the rules of global warfare. He proved, with cold and undeniable finality, that modern, mechanized wars are no longer decided simply by the fleeting courage of frontline heroes or the romanticized brilliance of isolated tactical maneuvers. Instead, the final margins of national survival are dictated entirely by the relentless, unyielding mechanics of global logistics, the calculated administration of human capital, and the quiet, uncompromising architects who build the machinery of total war from the ground up.